A reading from the first book of Kings. Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then he was afraid. He got up and fled for his life and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Yahweh. Take away my life, for I am no better than my ancestors." Then he lay down under the broom tree and fell asleep. Suddenly, an angel touched him and said to him, "Get up and eat." He looked, and there at its head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and drank and lay down again. The angel of Yahweh came a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you." He got up, ate and drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of Yahweh. At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of Yahweh came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I've been very zealous for Yahweh, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mount before Yahweh, for Yahweh is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking the rocks in pieces before Yahweh. But Yahweh was not in the wind. After the wind came an earthquake, but Yahweh was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but Yahweh was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I've been very zealous for Yahweh, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then Yahweh said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also, you shall anoint Jehu, the son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And you shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, of Abel-Meholah, as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill, and whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to John. This is the testimony given by John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" He confessed and did not deny it, but confessed, "I am not the Messiah." And they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" He answered, "No." Then they said to him, "Who are you? Let us have an answer for those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" He said, "I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as the prophet Isaiah said." Now they had been sent from the Pharisees. They asked him, "Why then are you baptizing if you are neither the Messiah, nor Elijah, nor the prophet?" John answered them, "I baptize with water. Among you stands one whom you do not know, the one who is coming after me. I am not worthy to untie the thong of his sandal." The Gospel of Christ.
The prophet Elijah is one who it's probably correct to say has pride of place when it comes to all the prophets of Israel. Even today, Jews will practice and conduct their services and their ceremonies like Passover and so on, and have a chair for Elijah. And it's curious that Elijah has such a noteworthy profile because he didn't write any books. Out of the 17 prophetic books that we have in the Hebrew Bible, 5 of them are called the major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And the reason they're called major is just because their books are so long. The 12 so-called minor prophets are called minor prophets just because their books are a whole lot shorter. But Elijah didn't write any books. And in fact, when it comes to his part in the story of Israel, he only appears for just over 5 chapters. In the end of 1 Kings, starting with chapter 17, and then in the first chapter of 2 Kings and the first 7 verses of 2 Kings chapter 2. He shows up for a very short period of time in the narrative. Now, he will certainly be referred to again several more times in the remainder of the Hebrew Bible, and then again in the New Testament as well, as you heard from our gospel reading when John the Baptizer was doing his thing and people are trying to figure out who he is, and they wonder if he could be Elijah reincarnate or something like that. And Jesus will refer to Elijah again, and of course, most notably at the Transfiguration, when Jesus is transfigured before Peter, James, and John, he is joined by Moses and Elijah, the one representing the law, the Torah, and the other one representing the prophets. And so the question still comes, though, how can Elijah be the one to represent all the prophets? Like, shouldn't that be Isaiah or something? Like somebody who wrote a big book? It is a good question. And I think the reason is, or at least a significant part of the reason why he is so significant, is because of what it is that he did and the point that he made while being a prophet to the northern kingdom of Israel. Elijah's name, by the way, means, "My God is Yahweh." Or you could say, "Yahweh is God," is what his name means. Which is a curious thing to know, given what it is that he's going to do in the midst of Israel. But let's get a little bit of background for what's happening. The Israelites, as we walk through the story, come out of Egypt. They wander around the wilderness for 40 years. They finally go into the promised land under the leadership of Joshua, and they take over the promised land. And at that point, then, they enter the period known as the period of the Judges. According to the biblical timeline, it's over 400 years long. The 12 tribes are in a loose confederation, and when there's a threat that comes at some point, they band together 2 or 3 of the tribes together under one military leader called a judge to then defend them and then to provide instruction for them as they carry on in life for a while. This pattern goes on for the duration of time. You might recall that a couple weeks ago, 2 or 3 weeks ago, we talked about how Samuel was the last of those judges. And indeed, that is the role he filled. And one of the things he did was to take care initially of something that had started to happen during the period of the judges. You see, the people of Israel were living in Canaan, and they hadn't eliminated all the Canaanites. And the Canaanites living around them had their own system of worship. They worshipped a pantheon of gods and goddesses. In other words, there were several gods and goddesses they worshipped. At the top was El Elyon, and then, depending on which source you read, either El Elyon's son or grandson is a god known as Baal. Properly, it should be Baal, but it's easier to say Baal, so we'll stick with that. Baal, and also a female goddess named Astartes, or Asherah, depending on where you read, became very significant to the Canaanites, and they were often referenced and often worshipped. Baal in particular was known as the storm god or the weather god. He was the one responsible for all of the atmospheric stuff. And so he would be portrayed as a god who could throw lightning bolts down from heaven. He could throw fire down from heaven. And he'd be responsible for the storms that took place and earthquakes and all of these things. That was his role. And for some reason, the Israelites, who had been told that their God Yahweh was not to be represented by anything visible, found themselves attracted to Baal and began to worship Baal during the period of the Judges. They began to exchange their worship of Yahweh to worship this other god, despite the fact that Moses on Mount Sinai said, "You shall have no other gods before me." They ended up worshiping Baal instead. And this was a significant challenge. Now, to Samuel's credit, when he emerged as the significant and last judge of Israel, he said to them, guys, you got to straighten up and got to make sure that we're walking in the way of Yahweh. You're wanting me to ask Yahweh to anoint a king for you? Okay, that's fine. We're going to do that. But you need to put away those Baals. Stop worshiping Asherah. Make sure you worship Yahweh and Yahweh alone. And they did. All through the reign of Saul and David and Solomon, and then even after the kingdom split into two with the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south, they continued to worship Yahweh alone. And in the north, they went through 6 kings. So for for just over 200 years, the people of Israel obeyed Samuel and paid attention to Yahweh alone, until a king named Ahab emerged. Ahab, well, you see, he married outside of Israel. He married a woman named Jezebel, who was from Sidon, which is up on the coast of the Mediterranean in what is now Lebanon, and she worshiped Baal. And so Ahab, probably out of love and respect for his new wife, decided that he would facilitate her worship too. And so in Samaria, which had become the capital city of the northern kingdom of Israel, because Jerusalem was the capital city of the southern kingdom of Judah, in Samaria he built an altar to Yahweh, an altar to Baal rather. He built a shrine to this other god. And not only was Jezebel worshiping at that shrine, so was Ahab. And so soon also were the people of the northern kingdom of Israel, violating that first commandment again and disregarding what Samuel had said over 200 years earlier. This became such a pervasive problem that at least 450 Israelites gave themselves over to be prophets of Baal in particular. They stopped worshiping Yahweh to the extent that they chose to be people speaking on behalf of Baal, 450 of them. And this is when Elijah shows up on the scene. They're worshiping Baal, and the one whose name is, my God is Yahweh, comes on the scene to confront them for what they're doing. And so Elijah goes and talks to Ahab and rails him out and says, what are you doing? This is totally travesty. This is not what Yahweh wants. We have to get this sorted out. But Ahab's not going to listen. He's paying attention to Jezebel. Jezebel was pretty influential in all of this. So finally Elijah says, you know what? Let's settle this once and for all. Let's go to the top of Mount Carmel. Bring your 450 prophets of Baal. I'll come by myself as the prophet of Yahweh, and we're going to determine who is actually God. And so he set out the rules. You go ahead and build an altar, and then I'll build an altar. Put a sacrifice on the altar, and I'll put a sacrifice on my altar. And then we're going to pray to our respective gods. And the God that answers with fire from heaven, in other words, the one that throws a lightning bolt down from the sky to light up the sacrifice, let that one be God. In setting this up, Elijah is actually already giving the prophets of Baal the home field advantage, if you will, because Baal is the storm god, right? He's all about throwing lightning down from heaven. So this should be fine. So he goes ahead and they get started, and Elijah says, okay, you guys go first. Please understand, I'm not calling you guys the prophets of Baal, but that's just the way it's working out for this choreography this morning. He goes to the prophets of Baal and says, okay, go ahead and start praying to your God. And so they spend all day long praying and dancing and doing rituals and even cutting themselves till the blood flows to try to show how serious they are about appealing to Baal to answer with fire from heaven. And it goes on all day. Elijah's chilling out here, starts making fun of them, starts joking around about Baal. Nothing's happening. And finally, they all collapse from exhaustion, nothing taking place. And then Elijah says, okay, my turn. And then he asks his servant to go ahead and not only prepare the sacrifice on this altar made with 12 stones, each stone representing one of the tribes of Israel, but he says, I want you to drench the sacrifice with water and dig a trench around the altar and fill it up with water and just make it so soaking wet. And then he prays for like 20 seconds. And all of a sudden, lightning comes from heaven, fire falls from the skies, and not only is the sacrifice lit up, it is utterly consumed. Not only is the sacrifice consumed, all of the rocks of the altar are completely obliterated. And not only that, all of the water in the trench and the ground, like all that's left is basically a black little crater right there. Because Yahweh responded so distinctively. You might remember hearing this story in Sunday school. The part you didn't hear was the fact that afterwards, after all the people start shouting, Yahweh is God, Yahweh is God, Elijah arranged for all 450 prophets of Baal to be gathered up and slaughtered for their absolute disregard for Yahweh. Because they turned their backs on Yahweh to become prophets for Baal, they lost their lives. And at that point, Baal worship was eradicated from Israel. Elijah was known for having made that clear distinction as to who the Israelites were supposed to worship. Now, the reading we heard today is after this event. It seems that Elijah was pretty drained from all the effort or whatever, but when Ahab told his wife Jezebel what had happened, she was incensed and breathed out murderous threats against Elijah, saying that I'm going to kill him. And Elijah was afraid, and so he ran away. He ran down from Samaria down to Beersheba in the south of the kingdom of Judah. And there he falls asleep. He's stirred awake by an angel who prepared him some food and drink, and he drinks it. He goes to sleep again, and then he's woken up again and says, here, drink and eat one more time. And then it says he travels 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of Yahweh. Horeb, by the way, is another name for Mount Sinai, where Moses gave the 10 Commandments. Now, just saying, it doesn't take 40 days to get to Mount Sinai, but it's probably said that way in the story to reflect the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness the Israelites had. Elijah takes 40 days in the wilderness to get to Mount Sinai. And while he's there, Yahweh comes to him and says, well, Elijah, what are you doing here? And Elijah says, well, I've been really zealous for you, and I've been being faithful to you, but nobody's listening, and they're killing the prophets, and I'm the only one left, and now they want to kill me too. And so Yahweh says, all right, stand firm, just hang on a second. Yahweh's going to pass by. I want you to pay attention. And so then there's this great wind that even splits rocks and stuff, but it says Yahweh was not in the wind. And then there was a great earthquake, but Yahweh was not in the earthquake. And then there was a great fire, which I'm quite confident would be lightning strikes, but Yahweh was not in the lightning. And then, depending how you translate this phrase in Hebrew, in the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, it says, then there was sheer silence. The New International Version says, then there was this still small voice. And in other translations, it says, then there was the sound of a very light wind or breeze. And Yahweh spoke from that silence, from that still small voice, from that breeze, and says to Elijah, Elijah, what are you doing here? And then Elijah gives him the exact same answer. You kind of wonder if Elijah caught the vision there. What's the significance of that little interplay about the wind and the earthquake and the fire and Yahweh not being in any of those things? I think what that is pointing to is to make sure that Elijah understood that Yahweh is distinctly different from Baal. Baal is the storm god. Baal is the god of weather. Baal would be the one who would produce the wind. Baal is the one who is said to produce the earthquakes. Baal is the one who throws down lightning from the sky. And the fact that Yahweh was not present in those things, I think, is Yahweh saying, don't try to equate Baal and me. I'm not simply a replacement. I'm not simply a different storm god. I am something else altogether. And so Yahweh eliminates the idea of ever suggesting that they would be interchangeable. And with that, then Yahweh gives them instructions and says, you're going to go up to Damascus in Syria, ancient Aram, and you are going to anoint Azael as the king there, and then you're going to anoint Jehu as king over Israel, and then you're going to anoint Elisha as your successor. And then he says something curious. Whoever Azael does not put to the sword, Jehu will put to the sword. And anybody that Jehu doesn't kill, Elisha will kill. Talking about anybody who's worshiping Baal. It doesn't work out that way, though. Very soon after all this takes place, a couple more events happen in Elijah's life. And then he hands off his mantle of prophetic authority to Elisha and then goes up into heaven in chariots of fire. And then it's Elisha who anoints Azael as king over Aram and Jehu as king over Israel. And it is Jehu, about 14 years after these events, who it is that finally kills the last of the prophets of Baal. So it's interesting that it didn't turn out the way Yahweh said it was going to turn out, but nevertheless, once and for all, Baal worship is eliminated from Israel. And so Elijah's significance in the story of Israel is that he is the one in this rather short period of time that was responsible for ultimately eradicating the worship of Baal in Israel. And from this point on, Israel is to be pursuing Yahweh and Yahweh alone. And that is what they endeavor to continue to do. Great story. Fascinating. It's fun, especially in Sunday school, imagining that showdown on Mount Carmel and all that. But once again, we are left with the question of what do we do with this story? How should we put it into practice? What does it mean for us as Christians, as followers of Jesus? Well, in my upbringing, the way that it was handled was basically to take the lesson and essentially mythologize it, essentially make it an illustration, and apply it today. And the question is, if back then Elijah was saying to the people, you must not have any other gods before Yahweh, and you must not have any idols, what are the idols in my life? Or what other gods am I worshiping? And that line of reasoning very quickly goes to things that are actually quite different from the worship of Baal. The way I was raised, the idea was, well, let's think about it. Is there anything that comes between you and God? Sports on Sunday, for example. If you end up staying at home to watch the football game instead of coming to church, that's an idol. You're putting that before God. That's sin. And it says in 1 Kings that that's really serious. You shouldn't be doing that. How about hobbies? How much money do you spend on hobbies? How much money do you give to the church? How much money do you give to missions? If you're spending more money on your hobbies are obviously taking the proper place of God in your life, and that's an idol, and it says that it's bad in 1 Kings. When I was pastoring in Nelson, I had the opportunity to start taking flying lessons, and I logged 13 hours flying an airplane, and it was a lot of fun, and it was great, and I ended up stopping because I had to put money elsewhere. But while I was doing that, I was talking with some colleagues, and I was saying, I'm kind of struggling a little bit. I'm loving flying airplanes, but I'm honestly thinking, should I be putting money into this? Should I be giving it to missions instead? That's actually what I said. And my colleague who was pastoring in Kimberley, BC, he's in the East Kootenays, a lot of wilderness area out there. He said, Derwyn, I think you got to have some balance here. He said, we have 4 quads in our family, right? And my wife and I and our kids, we go out in the back country there on our quads and we have a great time and it's fun. Could we have spent money giving it to missions instead of buying 4 quads? Well, yeah, we could have, but I don't think you're looking at something that is causing there to be a rift between you and God or something. Like, relax a little bit. What else could we possibly have? What are you more interested in? Would you rather read your Bible, or would you rather read that novel that tells some story that's totally fictional anyway? If you'd rather read that novel, that's an idol to you. That's where this reasoning goes. If we just take Elijah's dealing with Baal worship in ancient Israel and say, well, this just sets the tone for anything at all that we do that doesn't give priority to God, I hope you can see that that's a little bit of an overstatement. It's too much. It's not the same thing. Bowing the knee to Baal back then is different from catching a game on Sunday because it's an important game. One could certainly argue you should always choose the spiritual thing, but is that the same thing as the worship of another god? I don't think it is. What we see in this story is the development of Israel's theology. They're moving from this idea of knowing that there are several gods to what is known as monolatry, where you're supposed to worship one God, Yahweh, and not any of the others. And eventually, this will become what is known as monotheism, which is what Judaism is about. It's what Christianity is about. But getting to monotheism, you have to go through this stage first. You have to go through this stage of denying that you're going to worship these other gods to focus on this one God. And eventually, Israel concludes, you know what? There aren't any other gods at all. It's just Yahweh. There's just this one God, and the rest are false gods altogether. That's what we see being reflected in this story. But again, what do we do? How does that apply to us? Well, let me suggest, and this is a bit of a hint probably of what we're going to be exploring in the next couple of weeks as we continue our way before we get to Easter and to Christmas and the Gospels. And that is that a better approach to living for God, for living for Jesus, is not about some really clear black and white, anything that's there is an idol and that's terrible, and back then you would have been put to death, it's not that, but to recognize the importance of wisdom, to recognize the importance of evaluating the situation and circumstances. Because all of us have different personalities, so the way in which we approach living out our faith will be different on that basis alone. Each of us are in a different chapter of life, whether that has to do with our age or our marital status, whether we're living with people or by ourselves, what we do for work, what our workload is like, what our work schedule is like. All of these things play a part in how it is that we live our lives for Jesus. Wisdom is what is required more than some rules that simply say thus and so. And wisdom actually is a significant theme in the Hebrew Bible that often doesn't get as much airplay as it should. Because wisdom isn't as simple as right and wrong, these commandments, those rules, follow them or else. Wisdom instead causes us to say, what is the best way for me to conduct my life right now? What is the best way to make use of my time, my energy, and resources? How can I demonstrate that I love Jesus, that I love God, and that I love my neighbor with what it is that I have on the go right now? That is what we ought to be doing ourselves. We can let the story of Elijah be a catalyst to get us thinking differently, but how we execute that will require us taking hold of the wisdom that God provides. So let us do so. And let us do so with joy, endeavoring to live our lives in a way that pleases God and that we know that we can find peace in. Amen.